Good morning, all again. Uh, while we talked about in the panel was about embracing sustainability, we talked a lot on the ESG 2.0. We talked a lot on carbon footprint, scope 1 and 2, the scope 3, the value chain approach, etc. The purpose of this presentation is also to showcase why it is important to embrace sustainability uh, and majorly to go through the journey of sustainability so far, both globally and in India. So if I start about with what is sustainability, I think we covered this earlier as well. The whole point is we are, if you go by the WWF Earth, your replacement rate, we are actually consuming more of our resources than we are producing in a year. We have already overshoot for the last few years now the amount of resources that we produce in our country. And we've almost come to around 7 months. So we're almost in July and we have consumed for the entire year's productions, which means that we are consuming our resources much faster than what we were doing earlier. And in this rate, we are never going to leave anything behind for our future generation. So that's an alarming situation. And for the whole of the need, that's the whole point of being sustainable, so that we use our resources in a much more meaningful way, more judicious way, using the right technologies, so that our future generation can also enjoy the same resources and also build their future. Now, why the need for sustainability came into picture? For the last 2 decades, our emissions globally has been on an increased path. We have been emitting on a large volume. The CO2 ppm in the atmosphere has already touched 420. That is almost 50% increase from what it was in 1800s. The higher the ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere, higher the global warming that we see. The higher the global warming, the more erratic climate changes is what we're going to see, or erratic climate changes is what we're going to see. And that's what we are also witnessing on day-to-day basis. Our surface temperature has increased sharply. Now, globally, the talk is all about 2% or 1.5% or 1.5 degree and 2 degree temperature rise, but that's on average terms. If you go by just India, I think the temperature rise that is projected in near future is something around 8%, which means India is going to have another rise in temperature of in around 8% from what we are currently, which would be alarming. Like Delhi itself, which is something around 45 on an average in the summer, would touch something beyond 50 very soon. Life is going to be much more inhospitable in India, and given our population, our vulnerability also increases very sharply. For the last 9 years, and every year, we always hear that this is the warmest year than the previous year. So it's a trend now. There's not been a case where any of in between we had a year which was colder than the previous one. It's always been warmer than the previous one, which means that our temperature is obviously rising and it's not cooling anytime soon. Our energy consumption has also grown tremendously. We are still consuming 80% of the fossil fuel. We are clearing large amount of forest areas for different development purpose, be it for roads, be it for IT parks, be it for your residential projects. We are clearing more and more forest. We are left with very limited amount of forest. In India, particularly, I think the only part of the country which is northeast where you see the large amount of forest. Rest of the country is almost none. And if you go towards the north, like Punjab, you'll hardly see forest there anymore. Uh, the ocean has become more acidic. Now that's because of climate change. Higher the temperature, more the CO2 gets dissolved in the ocean water. Higher and more acidic the ocean becomes. The more the acidic the ocean becomes, there'll be threat to the sea life and coral reefs, which will eventually end up or result in end of human or the entire living world. And the last one is like with a lot of fertilizers and excess production and excess use, we can also see a lot of dead lakes, dead fresh waters across the country. So that's also another alarming case. So these are all kind of things that are happening for the last 2 centuries, and it's gradually just increasing. It's not anywhere becoming moderate or even average. It's just increasing in a very alarming scale. We tend to see most of us who are privileged don't see, or even if you see, we ignore. But the major brunt is faced by the vulnerable population of the country, and we as a country have a large population of a nature who are getting impacted more and more because of these changes. Now, having said that, then why does sustainability help? Like, so I could collect some information in terms of for the last 2 decades, whatever sustainability measures that were taken, be it by the government, be it by the corporate, or even by the individuals in many cases, what has it resulted into? Of course, we have seen the picture that how the world is changing, etc. But if you see by some studies like PwC Low Carbon Economy Index, they say that in the last 5 years, we've actually reduced by 2.5% of carbon intensity, which is in terms of GDP, right? The renewable energy, which was seen as a technology that could only be used in a very limited manner, has actually grown around 30% in 2023. Our solar and wind capacity in India itself has grown immensely. So that's something that has resulted, of course, it might still not have a large impact on the overall climate change and global warming that we see, but of course, it's a progress towards limiting our impact. Similarly, if you see in terms of investments, now before COVID, there were very limited investments in terms of sustainable investment in the market. But since COVID and even just around COVID, uh, the entire ESG asset under management has crossed $30 trillion globally, which means that this is the amount of money that is going towards project which would result in either green benefits or it will result in social benefits. So money is getting invested in those areas as well. If I just talk about Europe and their resource efficiency, because they are leading a lot of the charges in terms of circular economy, uh, their recycling rate has increased from 2004 from 37% to 48%. Uh, and this is percentage wise, which means, of course, the amount of material that they're recycling is now much higher, it's almost like double of what they were seeing in 2004. Now, in terms of corporate behavior, at least for the last 1 decade, we can see that more and more companies are now focusing in terms of disclosing, participating in a lot of these uh, initiatives, such as Science-Based Target Initiative or be it CDP, uh, presently like EcoVadis. People are participating more and more, trying to disclose. And when I say disclose, it also means that they're trying to improve because all of these initiatives are dependent on performance. So the more you better perform, uh, the better the score of the company is, which automatically motivates a lot of companies to focus on these areas. So we do see a lot of corporate and consumer behavior change in that case. People are more aware of impact. For example, uh, what we are personally impacting in terms of our carbon consumptions or amount of energy that we consume on a daily life. People are aware of it. And in some changes, we can see a lot of people, and I think Mr. Saurav also mentioned that people have started taking their own personal pledge that I'm not going to use water from shower, like I'm going to use a bucket for my shower. Similarly, using only your transport system like buses or metro to commute to my work, right? So consumer behavior is also changing over the last 2 decades now. In terms of adaptation, now that's a very important area given that climate is already changing. The global warming has already taken its course. It's a huge impact already on human life. And one way, of course, we are focusing a lot in terms of mitigation and trying to bring in your technologies which can help reduce your emissions, reduce your impact. But the other way, because these change is already there in the atmosphere, it's anyways going to impact us. So adaptation is a very key part. We have to save ourselves. A lot of fund is now going into adaptation. I have recently seen, I think there was one project which someone regenerated an entire coral reef, a large portion of coral reef, which is a really good sight to see because that's an area which is really hard to put investment and get any output out of it. So that's a lot of focus going in there as well. And similarly, in terms of plantation, we do see around a lot of plantation also happening. While we do see a lot of deforestation happening, which means that older forest, biodiverse areas are getting lost, but we're also building more forest. The only thing is that it should not be limited to just tree plantation. We should actually look into forest development rather than just tree plantation. So this is something that I could collect in terms of what sustainability has resulted into. Uh, Majorly, we can see a lot of the things have been done by the governments, but corporates are also not behind. Now, when sustainability is not embraced properly, what we have seen is like people who tend to greenwash, right? That's something that we most often see. We have seen cases like Volkswagen where in terms of the emission norms which they played with, right? We have seen Chevron and Shell getting more and more climate litigation across different jurisdictions. There is impact in terms of garment industry as well as pharma industry not meeting regulations provided by their global partners. Similarly, few of the cases that I could collect from India, where we could also see that not looking to sustainability more as an ingrained part of your business, how it has impacted. So one, of course, is a very old case of Vedanta Sterlite that we could see in terms of environmental and human rights issue. There were a couple of cases like with the poor stakeholder management, which is a very critical area for POSCO and Coca-Cola plants. And then there are Indian pharma companies not meeting standards and facing exclusion from the global supply chains. And then, there, of course, in terms of governance in India, we have seen a lot of cases where we have seen governance default. So, if in India, if I look into ESG risk in Indian businesses, the majority of the risk that we see in Indian business comes from the environment side, then from the governance, and then the social. Now, just quickly to go through the sustainability milestone, how much year it took to reach this stage. Since 1972 to 2024, or almost around 50 years that we have touched upon, a lot of changes has happened. Uh, I think major shift was from the Rio Earth Summit, where three COPs were formed for climate change, combating desertification, and biodiversity. Uh, I think post that, Kyoto Protocol was a major milestone where uh, your carbon emissions calculations and then offsetting came into picture. Developed countries started investing into developing nations in terms of buying carbon offsets or carbon credits. Then the Millennium Development Goals, which was not a big success, hence we came up with the SDGs, which is still in progress, and a lot of companies are trying to embed their strategies in line with the SDGs. Then we have the Paris Agreement, which was again a major milestone in the global ESG landscape, if you see, because this is the first time where companies started talking about taking their own responsibilities in terms of limiting their emissions. Every country then submitted their NDCs, which they have to follow, and also they have to meet the NDCs. So it became more like a global discussion point and then a global compliance in terms of meeting the carbon emissions goal. And then there is this IASSB, which is more on the unified global ESG reporting. So globally, there was a need, of course, to standardize how reporting happens. So that's something that was formed in 2021. And since then, there's many more we can see, like EU came up with their CBAM, which restricts or puts carbon emissions on certain type of products which are being exported to their market, particularly made by steel or cement and aluminium, and then fertilizers and etc. So that's one regulation that we see. We have also seen a German Supply Chain Act, which talks about doing due diligence of their suppliers across globally. And so the more and more standards are getting formed on, the more and more new areas are evolving in ESG, the more and more focus is building on some focus on the environment portion largely, but there are cases where a focus is a lot on the human rights as well, given that that's one area other than environment which is highly violated across the world, and it's an area where we seriously need to really focus on. I think the basically the short captures all different kind of regulations that are there currently already happening globally. So you can see the Companies Act and then the BRSR in India, similarly the German Supply Chain Act, which I mentioned about, and the rest. So more and more uh, countries are now getting together to form their own national mandates and national compliances in line with the ESG regulations globally. India journey, if you see, we started long back, of course. Environment Protection Act, Water Act, Forest Conservation Act. In India, majorly it was all regulations that what the corporates had to meet. Uh, and it's a long time that we kept only looking into those. So majorly EIA was the only way to know whether a project has a larger impact or not. And similarly, meeting these acts were the key part and foundational. But over the time now, from 2009 onwards, you can see there's a lot of focus now coming into the corporates. The larger one was majorly to safeguard environment, safeguard water resource and forest. Then the point started coming up into your getting data from corporates in terms of your NVGs, which started with BRR, and then we have the BRSR now, which is the stage we are currently in, where the evolution has taken us from merely meeting the compliances to now also disclosing in terms of very important forward-looking KPIs. So if I then and now, if I just a quick comparison, if you look into for a long time in India, ESG was always a burden. It was just looked into as a compliance, ki meet the tick box and that's it. Uh, CSR was a voluntary part, anyways. Disclosure for BRR was very limited. It was only 9 principles. You just talk about what you are doing, and that's sufficient for meeting anything. And in terms of ESG framework adoption, very few large corporates were only doing it because they were following the global mandate and they were looking into GRI or even TCFD, which came later towards 2017. That was what the market was. But if you see now in India, I think there is a lot of change that has happened in terms of the ESG penetration. Companies are not looking into ESG any longer just as a way of uh, disclosing and reporting. They're also taking advantage of doing the good thing. So if they're reducing their emissions, they're trying to project it more in terms of their papers and bids that they're submitting. So competitive advantage is something that we're looking into. Companies are also disclosing their very strategic differentiator, that how they are doing better than others. 2% CSR became mandatory, and hence a lot of corporates are now looking into making strategic CSR contribution rather than just donating the money for any philanthropic activities. They're actually planning their CSR much more properly because the amount of money that's coming in. So that focus has changed as well there. BSR core, particularly with the purpose of value chain coming into picture, I think we can see a lot of companies actually started looking into the value chain, started engaging with the value chain. So far, it was merely about just partnership with the value chain or value chain partners, but they started now looking into getting the data, and also, of course, in a future time, it would be also about trying to improve on those data. And globally, not globally, but in India, if you see, a lot of companies in India do report on GRI, TCFD, and SDGs, and that's a prevalent thing for the last 10 years, anyways. And but then we also see TNFD coming in, so new standards coming in for different areas in ESG, and companies are actually following it because of their demand from the customers globally, or because they think this is area that we're already doing, but now we have a structured format to also showcase it. So if I look into in terms of how the evolution has started happening, I think a lot of companies now have started forming their board level ESG committees. So it is no longer just a board looking into ESG maybe once in a year, but they have a committee which looks into the ESG activities and reports to the board as well. Many companies have now CSOs, as a part of the CXO chain. So you have a CSO, you can say a dedicated person or resource who looks into all sustainable measures in the company, which means there's a more focused approach towards these areas. A lot of companies in India as well, we see use of green bonds and ESG linked bonds. Banks obviously have the green deposits as per the RBI framework. But other than that, a lot of corporates have actually issued bonds and they've also taken green loans to fund their ESG journey. So if you want to do a decarbonization, you have to invest in certain technologies. The need for that is obviously money and investments. Taking loans in terms of green loans is what we see in the market as a prevalent activity. Europe, of course, far ahead, but then in India also we see a lot of movement in that direction. And then finally the supply chain part. So for a long time, India was only focusing majorly into their own activity, trying to focus how my premises are looking good, how I am able to manage my premises, and I'm also trying to limit my impact. But now the supply chain is something that we see being looked at by all of the companies. All of them have started mega projects in terms of assessing the suppliers and also hand holding them in terms of where they need to improve. So it's not just auditing the suppliers, but also in terms of helping the suppliers. The main driving force, I think we spoke in the panel as well. I think in India, if I see many cases that we see are coming from their consumers and investors who are basically asking for these changes. So, like for example, CBAM is basically a customer-driven activity. So, whoever is a customer in Europe for a company in India, they would obviously ask for the CBAM reports. Similarly, investor expectation, regulatory pressure always plays a bigger role. So in India, we see BRSR. Similarly, globally, we have the CSRD and etc., which is already there. And the final part, I think, which is still one of the most important part, but not looked at exactly the same way, is the risk management. A lot of these areas in ESG that we tend to focus is not with the perspective of only meeting and disclosure. It's also an area where it could be a possible risk in future. So knowing that it's a risk that can either impact me, whether in my reputation or in my market capability or financially, is a very important part. So ESG should not be looked as a standalone activity. It should ideally become part of an enterprise risk management. And that's how the ESG should further drive down into the company. So current challenges, I'll quickly cover. I think we already are short on time. So Scope 3, we have seen it's a major challenge. Major challenge, why? Because data collection becomes a huge and humongous activity. Assurances similarly becomes again another huge activity if you are working with companies having also supply chain to be part of it. And then, of course, technology and data. So we do see a lot of new evolving technology in terms of data collection, data analytics in the market, but I think it's still somewhere in between and needs to be really improved further, where AI can be used even better to help companies with their ESG implementation and solutions. Okay, I think I'll wrap up with the short of time. So, as a part of all of this activity, I think I'll just quickly cover. There are three major things that we see is going to transform the ESG in India. One is the national policy level. So, government is already playing a role. We can see SEBI has BSR, RBI is coming up with multiple regulations in terms of your climate risk, which eventually will trickle down to the corporates as well. The organization level, where basically the companies are looking into themselves as well as the value chain. And lastly, the ecosystem, which is the entire global market, which is driving ESG in a large scale. I think that's it from my end. Thank you. Yeah, we have time. If there's any questions from anyone, yes. Yeah. Hi. Here's a question.
Hi, Arnab. This is Radhika from S&P Global. My question, Arnab, is you touched a lot about ISSB, and then you also spoke about BRSR from an Indian standard. So from S&P Global perspective, we are into S&P Global ESG score, which is more based on international investors. One thing we do observe when we look at Asia and when we look at Europe is different emerging standards, like you mentioned. So Europe has CSRD, and most of Asia is adopting ISSB. So we've seen full adoption in some countries and partial adoption in Malaysia, Philippines. Even there's a sustainability stock exchange initiative doing this. Where do you see India in terms of timelines for ISSB adoption? Because at the G20, India in principle adopted ISSB. But what is the progress and the timeline that you would see? Because we see that the world trade also may start moving according to these sustainability standards at some point in time.
Right. Thanks, Radhika. I think so. At least from my discussions that I have with a lot of the companies, I do see the demand not there for ISSB yet. They're still struggling with GRI. They're still trying to figure out how they can report on TCFD. And that's how it has been so far. I think many companies are still not aware that we have actually signed up and also made a statement in G20 that we are going to do it. I think that awareness is still not there. So, bearing the larger ones, most of the companies in India are still, I think, out of sync in terms of what ISB is and what they need to report. So, in terms of timeline, of course, it's difficult unless the awareness program starts in this line. I think it will take a while for the companies to actually start doing it. Any questions? Anyone else? Otherwise, I think. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, you have? No. Okay, this one.
Hi, this is Anju. Besides all this, I've tried to gather some data with my one or two research students, asking various companies, especially manufacturing and service industries, how much are they putting in on sustainability front? How much are they ready to compromise on their profits or capital investments on sustainability front? Do you think this data can be used somewhere for better purposes or better utilization? Because till now, this is simply a raw data that I have. Do you think it can be used somewhere? Because if we use it properly, we use it appropriately, we can see which companies are not looking at it. Because I've seen quite many schools who are thriving on, say, 10 rupees or 10, 20 rupees kind of expenses on electricity till date. Schools with 500 students. Do you think it's possible? No. So these are the things which I have collected. That's raw data. Do you think it can be used somewhere?
To answer you, I think first is that a similar data is something that we collect also in the BRSR, where we talk about R&D and capex expense towards environmental, social, either through the products or through the operation that the company might have impact upon. So that's an area that the company has been asked. But if you see the BRSR analysis for the last year, only around 37% have answered, and that too the amount is minuscule.
Okay.
India as a country, I think, for a long time, if you see our R&D investments, both at the government level and as well as the corporate level, we are the lowest in the world. We don't
Right.
spend anything in terms of improving, in terms of anything that can help our product have limited impact on environment or even our services, right? So
Right.
that's an area. If that data is there with you, of course, I think it's an useful data in terms of maybe asking corporates to look into it and start thinking about it. But some amount of data is already there in the BRSR as well.
Okay. Fine. Thanks.
Thank you.